Imagine a power that connects every living thing in the galaxy, and then ask yourself what the limits of that power actually are. The answer, depending on who you ask, is that there aren't many. The Force isn't a fixed tool with a defined instruction set. It's an energy field that responds to the user, their training, their intent, their relationship with the light or the dark, which means the range of what it can do is almost as broad as the imagination of the people wielding it. Today we're covering every Force ability in Star Wars, light side, dark side, and everything in between. Everything starts here. Force awareness, also called Force sense, was the most fundamental ability in the entire spectrum, and for most Force sensitives, the first one they experienced without realizing it was happening. As someone opened themselves to the Force, their sensitivity to it naturally grew. They could feel the emotions of those around them, detect ripples caused by traumatic or significant events, sense impending danger before it arrived, and feel the presence of the dark side. It wasn't a technique so much as a baseline state, the foundation everything else was built on. Force telekinesis was an umbrella term covering every ability that involved manipulating physical matter through the Force. The applications ranged from the mundane to the battlefield-defining. Force push and pull moved objects and people at range. Force choke applied directed pressure to a target's throat. Force crush imploded matter entirely. Lightsaber throw extended a blade's reach across open space. Lifting objects from small debris to starships all fell under the same fundamental capability. The difference between practitioners was scale and precision, not category. Force-enhanced athleticism allowed users to push their physical capabilities well past what an exceptionally trained baseline human could achieve through conditioning alone. Strength, agility, pain resistance, reaction time, all of it could be elevated through the Force. The practical expressions included the Force jump, which propelled users to heights and distances that no unassisted human could reach, the wall run, and, for the record, the Force kick, which deserves considerably more acknowledgement than it typically receives. Controlled descent was the ability to slow one's fall through the Force, surviving impacts from heights that would kill an unprotected person. It was a focused, practical application of the broader telekinetic toolkit, directing Force energy downward to reduce velocity. Standard training for anyone who expected to operate in the kinds of environments where Jedi typically found themselves. Mace Windu presumably had access to this capability for whatever that's worth. The mind trick influenced and redirected the thoughts, behavior, and decisions of a target, generally towards whatever outcome the user needed. The application varied by era and philosophy. During the High Republic, the Jedi favored what they called the mind touch, a lighter, more suggestive approach that nudged the target toward making their own choice rather than overriding their will entirely. Dark side practitioners used mind control, which dispensed with the suggestion and simply imposed the desired outcome. The mechanics were similar, the ethics were not. Mind probe went further than the mind trick. Rather than influencing behavior, it allowed the user to reach into another person's mind and pull out what was there. Thoughts, emotions, and memories became accessible, searchable, as though the target's mental history was a filing system the practitioner could move through at will. Kylo Ren's use of the ability on Rey in The Force Awakens is the clearest modern example of what an aggressive mind probe looked like in practice. Force telepathy was the ability to communicate mind to mind across distances, transmitting and receiving thoughts, images, and information without any physical medium. At short range, it allowed for coordination in environments where verbal communication wasn't possible. At extreme range, it connected individuals across star systems. The Force bond between Rey and Kylo Ren demonstrated what this looked like at its most developed. Full sensory transmission, not just words. Foresight was a specialized extension of Force sense, enhancing the user's visual and spatial awareness beyond what their physical eyes could provide. It penetrated darkness, extended perception through solid surfaces, and allowed a practitioner to process their environment without relying on sight at all. For sighted users, it augmented combat reflexes and situational awareness in low visibility conditions. For blind practitioners like Chirrut Imwe, it served as a complete sensory replacement. It was also central to the training exercises that involved deflecting blaster bolts while wearing a visor. The blindfolded sparring that showed up in practically every Jedi's early training. Force lightning discharged concentrated electrical energy from the user's hands, capable of inflicting severe pain, causing lasting physical damage, and killing at sufficient intensity. Luke Skywalker described it as the most direct and malicious physical expression of the Force that existed. A light side variant, Electric Judgment, produced yellow, orange, green, or golden energy, and was designed to subdue rather than kill. Jedi Master Plo Koon discovered it accidentally while stopping a criminal, reported it to the Council immediately, and after extended meditation, developed it into a deliberate technique. The Council permitted him to use it while restricting it from general Jedi practice. Luke Skywalker and Jacen Solo both practiced Electric Judgment in later years. The standard Sith version remained entirely off limits for Jedi, regardless of context. Beast control allowed a Force user to mentally connect with animals, calming them, communicating with them, and in some cases directing their behavior. A tamed animal could serve as a mount, an ally in combat, or simply a less hostile presence in an otherwise dangerous environment. The Jedi used it frequently in the field. Among the more extreme applications, the Night Sisters demonstrated what beast control looked like when filtered through a dark side lens, something considerably less gentle. Psychometry was a rare, innate ability, one that couldn't be learned by those who weren't born with it. A practitioner could touch an object or enter a location and access the memories and events associated with it. The experience typically began with a flash of white light before resolving into a Force vision that conveyed sight, sound, and emotional residue from the past. It was especially useful for tracking. An object belonging to a target could reveal their location, state of mind, or recent movements. Quinlan Vos and Cal Kestis are the most documented practitioners. Force listening entered canon through Ahsoka when Jake and Syndulla demonstrated the ability aboard the Ghost. The technique required the user to release tension and open themselves to the Force entirely, not seeking anything specific, but allowing perception to extend beyond normal sensory boundaries. At its most developed, Force listening could detect events occurring in other planes of existence entirely, including the world between worlds. It had existed in Legends before its canonical introduction, but Jaken's use established it as part of the current continuity. Precognition, also called Foresight, allowed a Force user to perceive future events before they occurred. The scale varied widely by practitioner and circumstance. In combat, it functioned as an enhanced reaction to incoming attacks, knowing the strike was coming a fraction of a second before it landed. At the upper end, it produced genuine prophetic awareness. Jedi Master Sifo Dyas foresaw the coming Clone Wars years before they began, even as the rest of the Council dismissed the possibility. Force visions were distinct from precognition in that they moved in multiple temporal directions. Past, future, and distant present locations all fell within their scope. The critical limitation was interpretation. Visions weren't literal recordings. They were filtered through the emotional state of the viewer, which meant fear, hope, or attachment could distort what was actually being shown. The Jedi Council treated them with significant caution for exactly this reason. Many Jedi, Anakin Skywalker most famously, made catastrophic decisions based on visions that were accurate in content but misread entirely in meaning. The future was always in motion. The vision showed a possibility, not a certainty. Force stealth master users' presence in the Force, their alignment, their power, their location within the living currents that other Force sensitives could detect. Darth Sidious was the most consequential practitioner in recorded history. He concealed his nature from the Jedi High Council for over 3 decades while operating at the highest levels of the Republic's political structure, sitting in meetings with Jedi Masters, projecting no darkness whatsoever. Obi-Wan Kenobi and Yoda both used forms of Force concealment to shield themselves from Sidious and Vader during their years in exile. Shatterpoint was a rare perceptual ability that allowed the user to see the underlying structure of events and objects as though they were fracture lines in glass, identifying the critical weak point, the single intervention that would determine how everything else broke. Mace Windu was the most documented practitioner. The ability informed his combat style and his broader strategic thinking. Darth Sidious also possessed it. He used it to read Luke Skywalker aboard the shuttle Tidirium, sensing exactly where the fracture in the young Jedi's resolve ran. Force speed, sometimes called Force Dash, gave users a dramatic burst of accelerated movement for a limited duration. At full expression, the world around the practitioner effectively slowed down while they moved at normal pace within the acceleration, allowing them to dodge incoming attacks or cover ground faster than any unassisted being could follow. The limitation was sustainability. Pushing the ability too hard or sustaining it too long drained the user rapidly, leaving them temporarily depleted after the burst ended. Force projection allowed a user to create and transmit a full illusory duplicate of themselves across vast distances, convincing enough to interact with the physical world in limited ways. The cost was nearly prohibitive. The technique worked by pouring the user's living force into the cosmic force, the same plane where Force ghosts existed, and it demanded so much of the practitioner that extended use was fatal. Luke Skywalker's use of Force projection on Crate is the defining example. Every detail perfect, every movement convincing, and the effort it required killed him. Force illusion operated on the same conceptual foundation as force projection, but on a significantly smaller and less demanding scale. Rather than transmitting a duplicate across star systems, it generated localized illusions directed at nearby targets, misdirecting perception rather than deceiving it at a distance. Force barrier was a defensive application, a concentrated field of force energy projected outward to block harmful external forces. Explosions, poisonous gas, and other environmental threats could be held at bay. It occasionally manifested as a visible blue bubble, though the physical expression varied by user and circumstance. Force Orb was a highly specialized ability with a narrow but useful application, creating a contained bubble of breathable air around the user underwater. It also had a limited offensive use in aquatic environments, but only there. Above water, it had no meaningful combat application. Force healing allowed a practitioner to accelerate recovery from injury in themselves or others, channeling the force directly into damaged tissue. The mechanism had a cost. The user poured their own life energy into the target, which meant healing others was physically depleting. At high levels, force healing could address wounds that would otherwise require significant medical intervention. Rey's ability to heal the Krayt Dragon's wound and later Ben Solo after Palpatine's attack demonstrated the upper range of what the ability could accomplish. The Jedi acknowledged that technology was generally faster and more reliable for serious injuries, but technology wasn't always available. Force deflection allowed a user to redirect energy-based attacks, blaster bolts and force lightning primarily, without a lightsaber. Skilled practitioners could do more than simply deflect, sending the attack back toward its source. A small number of advanced users extended this to melee deflection, using the force to blunt or redirect physical strikes, including lightsaber attacks. Force stasis, often called force slow, halted objects or beings in place for a limited duration. Blaster bolts could be frozen mid-flight, opponents could be locked in position, lightsaber strikes could be stopped before landing. The freeze was temporary, the ability required sustained focus to maintain, and the effect ended when the user's concentration broke or was redirected. Force Severe allowed a Force-sensitive individual to close off their own connection to the Force or to suppress another's. The severance could be voluntary or trauma-induced. Several Jedi lost their connection following catastrophic emotional events. The shock of Order 66, profound grief, or sustained psychological damage could effectively cut someone off from the Force without deliberate intent. The disconnection wasn't permanent in most cases. Practitioners who understood the mechanism could reverse it, either in themselves or in others. Battle meditation created a network of force-connected awareness between a user and those around them, transmitting images, locations, tactical information, and in some cases raw emotional states across that network simultaneously. At full scale, it could influence both force-sensitives and non-sensitives on both sides of a conflict, making it one of the most strategically significant abilities in the entire spectrum. A sufficiently powerful battle meditation practitioner could shift the momentum of an engagement without raising a weapon. Force Meld linked multiple Force-sensitive minds together into a shared network, allowing them to draw strength from each other and coordinate at a level that verbal communication couldn't achieve. Where battle meditation could reach across an entire battlefield and affect non-sensitives, Force Meld was narrower and more focused, specifically connecting the Force-sensitives on a given side to each other, deepening their coordination and mutual awareness. Anakin, Obi-Wan, and other Jedi used it during the Clone War. The bond between Rey, Finn, and the others in the sequel era carried elements of the same principle. Wayfinding allowed experienced Force practitioners to sense whether distant planets or moons harbored life, extending awareness outward through the Force to read the living energy of worlds at range. It was an ability that took decades to develop to meaningful reliability. Most practitioners who could do it at all were senior masters who had spent their entire careers cultivating the sensitivity required. Dark Aura was a dark side application of Force Lightning's underlying mechanics. Rather than projecting electricity at a specific target, it charged the immediate surrounding air with malicious Force energy. Anyone within proximity took continuous damage from the field, and their movement slowed as the energy worked against them. It was a zone control ability as much as a direct attack, creating a space around the user that was actively hostile to anyone who entered it. Sith alchemy encompassed an entire field of dark side practice, any technique that used the Force to permanently alter physical matter, whether objects or living beings. The applications ranged from the enhancement of weapons and armor to the creation of biological monstrosities. The most notorious product of Sith alchemy was the Blackwing virus, a pathogen engineered through dark side science that produced effects no natural disease could replicate. The full scope of what Sith alchemy could achieve was deliberately kept fragmented in the historical record, which was itself a function of how dangerous the knowledge was. Force Scream was typically involuntary, a dark side eruption triggered by overwhelming grief, rage, or desperation that manifested as a shockwave through the Force itself. At baseline, it stunned and disoriented anyone in close proximity. At higher intensity, the effects were considerably worse. The most recognized example is Vader's first moments in his suit in Revenge of the Sith. In canon, Rise of the Red Blade depicted a controlled application, the recently turned Tualon Yaluna releasing a deliberate Force Scream during a sparring session that dropped his opponent into a catatonic state on the floor, with the physical effects still detectable after she managed to stand back up. Force Morichro, called the Touch of Death, gave a user direct control over another being's biological functions. Breathing rates, heart rate, metabolic processes, all could be slowed towards cessation. Applied to opponents, it was an effective subduing technique with a lethal ceiling. If the user stopped monitoring the target, the biological slowdown would continue past unconsciousness into starvation or dehydration. Applied to the self, a trained practitioner could enter a suspended state and survive without food, water, or air for over a year, though it offered no protection against vacuum. The Jedi Council classified it as prohibited for knights, with narrow exceptions granted to masters, Yaddle among them. Notably, Sith practitioners rarely developed it. The technique required a particular relationship with the Force that most dark side users never cultivated. A Force bond was a persistent link between two Force sensitives, most commonly a master and their Padawan, though it could form under other circumstances. Through the bond, emotions, thoughts, and images passed between the connected individuals across any distance. It deepened combat coordination, allowing intuitive responses to a partner's movements without communication. At higher intensity, it allowed one person to draw on or bolster the other's strength. The bond between Rey and Kylo Ren in the sequel trilogy demonstrated what an unusually powerful and involuntary Force bond looked like. Full physical presence across star systems, objects passing between them, both parties accessible to each other at any moment. Endure was the Force-assisted ability to withstand physical pain and injury beyond normal biological limits. At basic levels, it allowed a practitioner to continue functioning through wounds that would incapacitate an unassisted person. Masters of the ability could sustain combat effectiveness through injuries that should have been immediately disabling. Pyrokinesis allowed a Force user to generate and manipulate fire by agitating and heating air molecules through the Force. It served both offensive and utility functions, fire as a weapon and fire as a means of drawing objects or people toward the user through the current it created. Bleeding was the process by which a dark side practitioner corrupted a Kyber crystal to their will, pouring hatred, pain, and dark side energy into the crystal until it submitted and turned red. The process was described as a form of combat between the user and the crystal itself. Kyber crystals were Force-attuned objects that resisted corruption. To bleed, one required breaking its connection to the light. The red blades carried by Sith and Inquisitors were the direct result. Purification was the reverse, the process of cleansing a bled crystal of its dark side corruption. The crystal had to be reached through the Force, its pain acknowledged and addressed, its connection to the light restored. A successfully purified crystal typically turned white rather than returning to its original color, a mark of what it had survived. Ahsoka Tano's white blades came from exactly this process, purified from the red crystals of an Inquisitor she had defeated. Alter Environment was a large-scale ability associated with exceptionally powerful Force users, the Bendu and the Father among them, that allowed direct manipulation of weather and terrain. Lightning storms, shifting ground, and other environmental forces could be generated or directed through the Force. The scale of what was required to do this placed it well outside ordinary practice. It appeared in the record only when beings of unusual power were involved. Metamorphosis was Force-based shapeshifting, the ability to alter one's physical form into the appearance of another person, creature, or entity. It was rare among the Jedi and Sith, neither of whom developed it as a tradition. Among the Mortis gods and the Night Sisters of Dathomir, it was considerably more common, a reflection of how differently those traditions approached the Force and the body's relationship to it. Memory rubbing allowed a Force user to alter or erase another person's memories and learn skills through targeted telepathic intervention. The most documented use came on Mortis, where the Father used it on Anakin Skywalker after Anakin had seen his future as Darth Vader, removing the knowledge entirely rather than allowing it to inform or alter Anakin's choices going forward. Whether that decision was protective or manipulative remains one of the more uncomfortable questions the Mortis arc raised. Force empathy allowed a practitioner to sense the emotional states of those around them, and at higher levels to identify motivations, hidden feelings, and closely guarded secrets that the subject had no intention of revealing. It was distinct from Mind Probe in that it read emotional truth rather than specific memories or thoughts. Someone could lie with words while their emotional state told a completely different story to a practitioner with developed Force empathy. Deadly Sight concentrated a Force user's fury and hatred and projected it through direct eye contact with a target. The effects were physical and immediate, blistering skin, vaporizing extremities, causing the body to burn from the outside in. Death by focused malice with no weapon required beyond the user's own hatred and the willingness to direct it. The only confirmed practitioner after the Rule of Two was the Dark Jedi Saris. There's a case in the comics for Darth Maul having used something similar, though the consensus is that what he deployed was a different ability entirely. Force rage allowed dark side practitioners to weaponize their own anger, channeling it through the Force to temporarily amplify combat effectiveness across every relevant dimension. Durability, aggression, the force behind attacks, and overall fighting potency all increased while the ability was active. Kylo Ren and Darth Vader were among its most documented users. The trade-off was in what the ability required. Sustained rage as fuel meant that the user had to actively cultivate the emotional state that the Jedi considered the most dangerous path toward the dark side. Mechu-deru was a dark side ability that granted its user an intuitive mechanical comprehension, an innate understanding of how constructed systems functioned that went beyond anything technical training could provide. At its baseline, it allowed Sith practitioners to interface with and manipulate mechanical systems through the Force. Pushed further, it enabled the creation of technobeasts, grotesque hybrids of organic matter and machinery, living beings forcibly merged with mechanical components through dark side science. One of the more disturbing applications of Force ability in the entire record. The ability to persist as a Force ghost after death required specific training, a path first rediscovered by Qui-Gon Jinn and passed by him to Yoda, who carried it forward to Obi-Wan Kenobi, Anakin Skywalker, and eventually Luke Skywalker. The technique involved releasing the self into the cosmic force at the moment of death rather than simply dissolving into it, maintaining individual consciousness within the larger current. The Jedi who achieved it could appear to the living, communicate, and in some cases provide guidance that extended well past their physical deaths. Darkside practitioners had a parallel ability, but the mechanism was entirely different and far more limiting. Rather than integrating with the Force, darkside spirits anchored themselves to physical objects or locations. Darth Momin was bound to his helmet. The Grand Inquisitor was connected to a High Republic-era temple. The attachment that kept them present also kept them trapped. Essence transfer was the most direct dark side answer to mortality, moving a practitioner's consciousness out of a dying body and into a new one. Ancient Sith Lords used it to cheat death repeatedly, cycling through bodies and continuing their existence long past any natural lifespan. Darth Bane's use of the technique was controversial even among Sith, with questions about whether what transferred was truly the original consciousness or something corrupted in transit. In more recent eras, Palpatine combined essence transfer with advanced cloning technology to create a prepared host body, eliminating the uncertainty about availability that had made the technique unreliable for his predecessors. Force drain extracted life force or force energy from a target and transferred it to the user. The victim was diminished, sometimes fatally, by what the practitioner absorbed. Darth Malak used it to sustain himself through captured Jedi, keeping them alive specifically as a renewable resource. Darth Nihilus represented the extreme end of what force drain became when taken to its logical conclusion. His entire existence had become organized around consumption, eventually operating at a scale that threatened entire planetary populations. Palpatine's use of it against Rey and Ben Solo at Exegol, drawing their combined force energy to restore himself to his prime, was one of the more direct demonstrations of the ability's ceiling in the current canon. Teleportation was among the rarest abilities in the entire Force spectrum, near instantaneous movement from one location to another through the Force. It was more associated with beings like the Bendu and the Night Sisters than with Jedi or Sith traditions. The mechanics behind it remain among the least documented of any Force ability, in part because so few practitioners existed who could demonstrate it reliably. Force Cloak involved the manipulation of light and sound waves around the practitioner, bending both to render the user effectively invisible to the naked eye. It was distinct from Force Stealth, which masked presence in the Force itself. Force Cloak addressed physical perception rather than Force perception. A practitioner using Force Stealth alone could still be seen by the naked eye. Force Cloak removed that remaining vulnerability, making the user difficult to detect through almost any conventional means.